Yeah. Dzień dobry. Thank you very much, dear Henrika, for hosting us here. This is a very impressive room, I have to say. It's very Polish. I am Sylvie Kaufmann. I'm a journalist with the French newspaper Le Monde and a long-time associate with this wonderful crowd of ECFR. And I'm going to moderate the next panel, which is also about European security through coalitions of the willing. And I'm going to do this with Clément Beaune. He's the High Commissioner for Strategy and Planning at the Office of the Prime Minister of France. Welcome, Clément. You can clap. With Sir John Sowers, who is the former head of MI6 and now chairman of Newbridge Advisory. Welcome and good afternoon. Please have a seat. And Thomas Bagger, our own Thomas Bagger, who is the former Secretary of State of the German Foreign Ministry. Very nice to see you, Thomas. Yeah, please. And also our own Camille Grand, whom you all know, who is Distinguished Fellow of ECFR. So maybe you have another. Yeah. Okay. So European security, coalitions of the willing. Of course, this has even more relevance now that we have almost all committed to increase our defense budget to up to 5% of our GDP. As we all know, this is not a magic figure, and neither it is an automatic way of improving European security, but this is what we are going to talk about. In the next 50 minutes, we'll discuss this, and we'll have a moment to have an exchange with you and have a Q&A moment, yes, at the end of this session. So since we are just out of this very interesting NATO Summit in many respects, maybe I'll start with both of you, Thomas and Camille, by asking what are your takeaways, your main takeaways of this summit. Thomas, maybe you'll start if you don't mind.
Yeah. Merci, Sylvie. I was struck when Mark presented the opinion poll, and there is this either or. You're either pro-Europe, but then you're sort of anti-Trump, or you're pro-American, which means you're anti-EU. I think what I find striking when I look back at the NATO summit is it was not either or. It was a win for Trump, and one he took home and made explicit in his own press events and his own language. But it was clearly also a summit with Europe, you may say finally or significantly, investing into its own strength. So in a way, it was sort of hope and prepare at the same time. It was a reaffirmed commitment to an alliance where we all know that, and we'll discuss that in a closed session tomorrow where we can be a little more explicit, but we know that trust has been shattered, and it's not easily sort of fixed by a photo opportunity in The Hague, but it has been reaffirmed, and we prepare for the worst. So I think in that sense, the summit in The Hague for me was not an either or, it was actually both. And it just tells me that it does not have to be either or. We will not hasten as Europeans a transatlantic break, and for very good reasons. For very good reasons, because there is no way to quickly replace the United States, and we will struggle with that for the years to come. But I think when I read some of the commentary, I stumbled upon one this morning that said The Hague was a display of strategic self-abasement of the Europeans. Well, you can take that as an intellectual position from the outside and sort of comment on the scenery. But on the substance of it, I would maintain it was a clear investment of the Europeans, a commitment of Europeans to invest into their own strength, which is the right thing to do. And it was a win for Trump at the same time. And in that sense, I think it was a success. And maybe final point, because of the coincidence, the draft German budget and the financial planning of the new German government for the next 4 years has actually commits the government to reach 3.5% of core defense spending already by 2029. So not as concluded in The Hague 2035, but by 2029, trying to set an example for exactly the kind of speed that that Nico just mentioned in the session before.
We'll come back to this because it's very important. So, but we can always say we can always blame the media, right, for giving this simplistic image of the NATO summit. But maybe we can say also that one side is more vocal than the others. What was your takeaway, Camille?
No, it was fascinating to be in The Hague and to sort of get the mood in the room. We have to be honest, it was not a given. People on day one were quite nervous about what would play out. How would the Iran file impact the summit? How would the Spanish dissent on the 5% impact the summit? How would Trump approach the exercise? And I think that's, in all fairness, now it's easy to say, oh, that was a sort of soft landing where we wanted, but the reality is that was not a given, and I think we should give credit to those who worked for that. What I wanted to stress on that is that it is very much more the beginning of a journey than the end of a journey. And I think that's what the Europeans and Radek Sikorski just stressed that in his own remarks. I think it's really important to really point at that. What I mean by this is that, of course, we got the good news, the 2.5, if I may put it this way. The 5% on the one hand, which was a big win for Trump because that is the figure he had been using. Of course, that figure is, we are playing with the 3.5 plus 1.5 by 2035, and there are probably about a quarter of the alliance that is hoping that they will never get to there. But there's also a good 2/3 that are very and genuinely committed to this in different ways. And in any case, altogether, everyone is going to do a significant effort, even those who might be not exactly on target by 2029 or by 2035. On Article 5, and that was really important, because including on day one, there was a sort of doubt casted by President Trump when he said before taking over.
Big doubt,
that there are different interpretations, which is, by the way, technically correct. But when it comes from the President of the United States, that's slightly troubling. And I can tell you that in The Hague, there people were worried. But on the other hand, we got it the exact good wording in the summit declaration. And we even had the US president saying, of course, he believed in it, otherwise he wouldn't be here. Which, those things were important. So that's the good news story. And I would add to that, and that went a little bit unnoticed because everyone also focused on the fact that President Zelensky was not at the table for the political conversation, even though he was at the dinner, blah, blah, blah. But the wording on Ukraine in the summit declaration is very interesting. It stresses that the Ukrainian security is part of our security. That is, I think, very significant, and kudos for that. Also, it states Russia as a long-term threat. Yeah. When you look at statements, recent statements in the UN context or in the G7 context, I think it was really important to have those things. Let me finish with the to-do list in 30 seconds. All of this should not suggest that we're done and we should rest on our laurels and that we're back to the wonderful world of good old transatlanticism. This is over. But we are we are in an environment where we still have we have no clue about what's going to be the nature and size of the US presence. And this administration said, we'll tell you after the summit how many US troops are going to stay in Europe. And that's, so that conversation is going to be a very complicated one, and I really hope it's going to be a coordinated conversation and not a series of unilateral decisions. Number two, of course, we haven't solved or sorted out our policies, and we don't have a really shared policy on Ukraine and on Russia, and that is sort of a problem. And finally, the balance between the notion of a European pillar, the role of the Europeans in this alliance has not been fully resolved, and it's going to be about how much do they spend, of course, but also what level of commitment and responsibility they're ready to take.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you tend to see the half-full glass rather than the half-empty glass, yeah? Okay, good. Let's stick to this since we're in a good mood at the beginning of this conference. Maybe I'll turn to Camille before Sir John. Clément, I'm sorry, thank you. Yeah, these 3.5, not even mentioning the 5, but 3.5% will be difficult to reach for a number of countries, including ours. You've worked on this. You've produced a document trying to find solutions. Do you think it's possible? I think you calculated that that would mean doubling the French defense budget. So how do we do this? I mean, we'll talk about Germany later, which has an easier task, but how do you do it in France?
Merci Sylvie, and thank you for the invitation. Just before jumping on this, starting with the NATO Summit, because of course it is where this target has been set or confirmed. It's interesting to recall first that the summit and some of the people in the room who were there or participated in the preparation is now designed to be as short as possible, so that the American president stays as short as possible, and so that we diminish the risk of disappointing him, of being disappointed by him. It's a signal that we should not ignore. That said, I think it went as well as it could, and congratulations to those who made that possible. It was not a given, as Camille said. It landed on this 5% target, and as Camille said also, and as we know, it's more like 3.5, the real figure, than the 5%, because the 5% is, of course, somehow to match the American president's targets and communication targets, but we know that it's 3.5 plus 1.5, and the 1.5 is a bit more blurry. So it's really 3.5, which is already something very big. Even though, and just to nuance a bit, we thought the kind of common expectation a few weeks ago was like it would be more like 2030 than 2035 to reach it. So it's not as ambitious as it could have been. But it is a very big effort for a lot of countries, as you recalled. For, if I take EU formats, the EU 27 as such are just below 2% now, in average. So reaching 1.5 in addition in a few years, even for some countries, and not the less important ones like Germany, it will be before. It will be a big ambition and a big challenge. For France in particular, not because we don't want to invest in our defense. We are above the EU average at the moment. We've invested quite early in our what we call the military law program, of the military programming law, sorry, and we will have doubled our military spending between 2017 and 2030. So this is a current law, and this will bring us to 2.3, 2.5, 2.4 if we don't change anything. If we do the extra investment, which is necessary, it is doable. To put a short answer to your question, but it is a huge challenge. And to zoom on the French case, of course, we will not, that's what we demonstrate in our memo, we will not do it through only one tool or one leverage. Spending cuts, taxation, I do not recommend, we are already EU champion, or structural economic reforms, which all take time to produce revenues and growth. So we will have to do a mix of efforts. This is doable, but this is a big effort, I was saying. Just to give, you recall the magnitude of the efforts, it will mean between 2025, so this year, and 2030, if we take the 3.5% target for France in 2030, it will mean doubling the current military effort for our Ministry of Defense. So it's big. It's around 60 extra billion to find out.
It's huge. It's more than big. It's huge.
It's huge. But I think it's necessary. It will be a political debate, of course, to see the mix of levers we activate to reach this target, but it is possible. We give the examples of the illustrations in this note that was translated into English for those who are interested, and we will probably cover that and go back to that. But I think not only for France and not only for financial reasons, but we would need somehow an EU dimension, an EU budget dimension, or maybe an EU borrowing capacity dimension, even if it is sensitive, in this area. But I conclude on that. If we do something at the EU level, in complementary to what we do at NATO level or in some ad hoc formats, it cannot be just a financial dimension, because otherwise France, other countries would go to Brussels and say, okay guys, we need money. I think it doesn't work. But if we make it an industrial project, if we make it a strategic project, I think it will have a lot of meaning to involve the EU in this extra financial effort as well.
Good. I think I'll go back to Thomas later to have a German view on this. John Sawers, there's one. If the European goal is to compensate for the likely loss of part of the US presence in Europe in military field, there's one domain, one field where the US seems to have a quasi-monopoly. It's intelligence, ISR, right? Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Huh? How can we do this within those this framework? I mean, it's not only a question of money, I guess. I mean, how can we remedy this, and how do we explain that we haven't invested at all in this, Europeans?
First of all, can I thank everyone for inviting me here. It's an honour to be on this panel. I think I agree with what my colleagues have said about NATO and the relative success of the summit in a very difficult context. We're seeing not just the threats to Europe rising and the level of support from the United States receding, diminishing, we're also seeing the nature of warfare change dramatically. And we all have views on what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and the remarkable success they've had against Hezbollah and against Iran in the last 2 weeks. But one of the most striking aspects of it was the extent of the Israeli intelligence coverage of the forces hostile to them in those 3 theaters. And they've done that with a level of electronic monitoring, surveillance, a strategic intelligence from human sources, technical intelligence through SIGINT and through satellites and so on, which is a result of literally decades of investment by a small country in this. We're seeing in Ukraine the extraordinary evolution of warfare there, increasingly unmanned, increasingly about surveillance, and these are areas where it's actually quite important for us because, as Mark said about the attitude towards conscription, everybody supports conscription except those who want to get liable to be conscripted. And we are finding, certainly in my country, that attracting people to join the Royal Navy when they're expected to go to sea or out in a submarine for months on end without access to their phone or the internet, it's getting almost impossible to recruit people. Now, we are still in the UK investing in a future combat aircraft project with Japan and Italy, which has a pilot in the cockpit. Now, are we really going to have pilots in the cockpits in 20 years' time? Likewise, in submarines, are our submarines going to go to sea with a crew on board, or will they be will it be an unmanned operation? I think the speed at which the battlefield and the conflict is changing and the nature of warfare is changing is as important for us as the figures, the percentage of our GDP that we're going to be spending. So the specific answer to your question, Sylvie, about can we develop this battlefield capability is yes, but we're a long way behind. As I understand it in Ukraine, when a Russian unit emerges, it can be fixed upon, by a satellite, identify its position, and then fixed upon by a weapon within 30 seconds. The Israelis can do something similar in less than 10 seconds in Gaza. And a target emerges, is locked onto by a satellite or a surveillance system. A weapon can identify it and engage it within a matter of 10 seconds. In Europe, we'd be lucky to do that in half an hour. And that's only the better end of the European military capabilities. So that's it's the nature of warfare that's changing in particular. And I've got some other comments I'd like to make at some point.
Yeah,
but
please,
we'll
please.
come back
Go
to
ahead,
that.
go ahead, go ahead.
Well,
Yeah.
the other thing I think, I was one of those people in Britain who thought that leaving the EU was a terrible thing to do, and that we're paying a huge price for it. But we're now in the situation we're in. We're not going to reverse that quickly. I think as we look at Europe's military capacity and how we manage in a world where the Americans are less present, and even where they are present, they're less reliable. We can't give them up entirely for reasons that Thomas says. We are so integrated with American military capability that it would take a decade to do that. But I think we need to recognize that of the 6 major military nations in Europe, nations with military capability, 3 of them, France, Germany and Poland, are in the EU, and another 3, Britain, Ukraine and Turkey, are outside the EU. And if we want to have a coherent European approach, although Ukraine is not sadly yet a member of NATO, I think NATO is the only way to do it. And NATO is often viewed by the Americans as the Americans doing something for Europe. But NATO actually has a strong European dimension, and the NATO Article 5 requires European countries to stand with one another against any threat. And it's that, I think NATO is the right vehicle. That's not to say the EU doesn't have an important role. It does have an important role, precisely in the areas that Clément was saying about mobilizing funds, including new borrowing, to raise defense capability. And the EU clearly has more of a political capability, to a political traction in Europe than NATO does have. But I think if we're going to focus on military, core military capacity, including in the areas you mentioned, you first asked me about, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so on, then we have to find a way of Europeanizing NATO and embracing difficult countries like Britain and Turkey and Ukraine into a wider European effort.
Thank you very much. Well, you've opened a lot of avenues for our discussion. There's one thing I want to go back to before we talk about what John just mentioned, but about this financial situation and the financing of European security. Germany is going to have a very important role. Are we having a second Titan vendor? How much has it really changed? And how do you accommodate with this power of financing other countries in Europe, like France, for instance?
Well, I think, first of all, Sylvie, I think the incoming Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, in February and March did something very, very important for all of us who care about foreign and security and defense policy. And that is, he created politically a key to the fiscal space that Germany has available. And that fiscal space is, as we know, among the bigger countries, bigger than that of most of its peers. And that in itself, I think, was extremely important in this volatile moment after Trump taking office, after Zelensky in the White House, to provide an anchor for Europe, also to send a signal to the outer rim of the European Union that the center will actually hold. I think that is extremely important. But you also have to recognize that decision that was welcomed and is welcomed by most of the people here in the room and the foreign and security policy types was not exactly popular with most other people, including in his own party, who felt that he had made very different promises in the campaign to do reform first, slashing welfare and wasteful spending, and thereby create new revenue that you can then spend on new priorities. which is one of the reasons why I think that it would be trying to take two steps at the same time. If you jump into the debate about a new European vehicle, but the question that Clément raised, of course, will not go away. It can't go away. It will come back. And Germany, so I think Germany has done a very important thing very early for the new coalition government. But as Camille said, this is only the first step and a long way. First, this enormous amount of money has to be spent wisely and productively, which will be a huge challenge, and even more so for a new government with very little executive experience. And it is only the one step that relates to capabilities, but the political will, the intention side, the mentality side, everything that relates to the question of conscription that John mentioned, all of that has to be addressed along this way. And it may actually prove more challenging politically than creating a key for this fiscal space.
Yeah, you can already see a problem with conscription as well, right? I mean,
yes,
then recruitment.
I think, well, you know, this is a step-by-step approach. And right now, I think all the coalition could agree on is to say we will introduce some voluntary measures and increase sort of recruitment, but will not do it by reintroducing conscription as we knew it when I was a conscript. But that is for later discussions. And I think it's important that we don't sort of, the NATO summit, as I said, was not an either or. It was an important starting point of a longer way. But there are challenges for all of our countries along that path. And there will be a challenge, not just for NATO, but also for the European Union. And I think, John, I think Britain has used its time extremely well between February and April in sort of French turmoil and German transition to say, look, on Ukraine, London can take the lead and thereby make a contribution to European security that is extremely valuable and important. And when we will discuss security in Europe in the future, Britain will be part of that discussion. We're sitting in Warsaw today. Poland, of course, will be part of that discussion. There's a Weimar Triangle format that the German Chancellor invests in and that he holds in very high regard. I should say from this podium, it will be very important to include Italy in that debate, both because of its political importance, but also because of its defense industrial capabilities. The challenge is that on the European level, none of these formats is really fully legitimate.
Absolutely.
The only legitimate format on the EU level is the 27. But if you want something efficient, you have to have something small and powerful. And you can't settle for one of them. So you will oscillate between different groupings and formats to try to drive a process that you can then translate into the 27. And one of the moments to translate it into the 27 will be the next multi-annual financial framework. And the whole question, what role will defense play in that big European budget that is coming up? And that will also be an important question posed to Berlin and the new German government.
So in French, we call this a géométrie variable. And now we also call it coalition of the willing, no? You wanted to say something, Clément, and I know you have to leave a little bit earlier, so please go ahead.
No, it's okay. But yeah, just to bounce back on the financial dimension, as I said, and even for France, but of course, the challenge will be more or less, but always important for all European countries, let's say, including the UK. I think it is possible to find this money. The question, I think, is first, is it possible to do it while keeping other priorities high on the agenda? Because the rest is not disappearing. I think all Europeans want their social model to be kept more or less the same. I think all Europeans, even if we have debates, want somehow the green transition to be financed, and so on. So the question is not, do we have enough money for defense? Is do we have extra money for defense while keeping the other priorities together as well? This is the biggest financial and political challenge. The second challenge, Thomas mentioned it, it's true for Germany, but it's true for most countries, if not all. Even if we find the money, even if we put it on the table, can we spend all this in a few years? Is our industry able to follow? Are we able to spend it at all? And Germany had challenges, we had too. Especially if we all increase a lot our defense spending at the same time. Do we have engineers? Do we have resources? Do we have people joining our armies and so on and so forth? And are we able to spend wisely? I think people will accept that we do a sustainable extra defense spending effort if we demonstrate also that it is efficient and effective. And this is where I think the EU can play a role by, or European formats, by cooperating. It is not just a nice-have European cooperation in terms of defense industry now for pro-Europeans or federalists. It is a must-have, I think, to make sure this money is spent wisely and is spent at all. And the final challenge, just in one sentence, is, and Thomas and others mentioned it implicitly, is mentality and political support. At the moment, there is a momentum because the Russian threat is very clear, because the war in Ukraine is visible, because all these threats, all these war theaters are visible to our public opinion. And even what happens in Middle East makes it more visible and important. But what happens in 6 months, in 1 year, in 2 years, we have to make it a strong and sustainable commitment, which will be the most difficult for all governments and all public opinions and all political forces, especially because in all our countries we have forces which explain to people, you don't need to spend that much money. We are for peace, they are for war, and so on and so forth. So this will be the big challenge, to find the money, but to keep the political momentum, to put all this money in the next years, not just in the next months, on the table to improve our security.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Talking about coalition of the willing, new format, European pillar of NATO. There's, of course, within NATO, the Europeans didn't do enough. They have been asked for a long time to do more. They haven't done it. But there's another aspect of this debate, which is that the Americans always wanted to keep some share of control, right? So all these formats that John Sowers mentioned, they're all without the Americans. Are they ready? I mean, we know, we always talk about Trump wanted to leave, but there's also a possibility that they leave but keep control. And how, for instance, Camille, you've worked within NATO. How do you see this issue?
No, I think the new quid pro quo is not there yet. That's what I was mentioning in closing. We still have to figure out what I call NATO 3.0 will look like. What does a European pillar within the alliance look like? What is it that, and what are the consequences on the way NATO operates? Indeed, NATO was always a bit of an animal farm of everyone's equal, but some are more equal than others. And there was always this central role of the United States, which is likely to remain, should the US remain committed to the alliance, a critical ally. But on the other hand, if we look at things, and I think we need to be honest about this, the numbers in the peacetime establishment have changed. You know, there used to be more than 300,000 Americans in Europe during the Cold War. We are down to about 100,000 after a surge about Ukraine. I expect these numbers to go significantly down, and that's a fact. The US Aircom commander of all air operations for NATO, was stressing in a recent workshop I attended that fantastic, there will be 600 last generation fighter aircraft, and even better, 550 of those are going to be European. So the reality is not that, the notion that the Americans are in charge of everything is changing. Of course, there's still, and this is where, if we really need to defend Europe with less America, or even without America, at least as the first respondent to a crisis, we need to work on enabling the Europeans to operate much more on their own. So that has to do with the so-called strategic enablers, so all those capabilities that, in all fairness, only the Americans provide today, at least in large quantities. And that is the challenge of the next decade, I would say, to invest into those capabilities, to have Europeans that are capable to respond to a crisis as the first respondent, not wait and see. And that's I would argue the best chance to have the Americans coming if they see the Europeans being able and willing to react to a crisis somewhere. The second thing is all of this ultimately is likely to change the shape of the alliance. Once it's really rebalanced, once that burden shifting has occurred. In Washington, I heard burden dumping, which is maybe a bit too far. Hopefully, once that burden shifting has occurred, again, hopefully in an organized manner, we will end up with something quite different. And I don't think it's all about command and who's going to be the next secure and all of that. Usually, immediately people run to the conversation of should that person be a Brit, a German, or a French? And I always say that is not the issue, and there are lots of good reasons for having an American secure still. But having said this, this will be fun. You know, we need to recognize that things are changing and have changed enormously, and that's not going to go away. And if that is the case, then the alliance will look quite different in 10 years from now. You can't have a rebalanced alliance with the same political dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Before I turn to the audience, I can't resist asking you, Jordan, a question about Five Eyes. Is it still working?
The answer is yes, it is still working.
As well as it.
And the Five Eyes has got a long history, of course. It goes back to fighting in Second World War in particular, and the depth of trust that built up between the countries that became the Five Eyes, and the common approach to policy of starting with an intelligence assessment of what the reality is, and then only on the basis of an agreed intelligence assessment, you then work out what the policy options are. So there's a cultural, intellectual, deep trust between the Five Eyes, which is very hard to replicate. And even in politically difficult times, it remains very solid. And of course, it's not just an intelligence sharing alliance. It's an intelligence production allowance. Mm-hmm. And that's what people from the outside don't often understand about the Five Eyes. We share intelligence with everyone. Mm-hmm. We don't share the capacity to produce intelligence with everybody, although there have been some very good partnerships. In my time, we developed a very close relationship with the DGSE in France on SIGINT collection, for example. It's a... so we have to see this in various ways. People talk rather loosely, well, why not include Japan in the Five Eyes? Well, Japan's got no intelligence production capacity to speak of. So what's the point of doing that? In difficult times, obviously with someone like, I won't go into details because we're on the record here. Well, you mentioned the name. You know, it's there are difficulties, there are challenges there. In the first Trump term, the way in which we avoided or minimized risk was by keeping things between the agencies. Uh-huh. Now, whether that's going to be possible in a context where you have unified executive authority in the United States, we'll have to see. But I do know that the willingness between the agencies to carry on cooperating on operations as well as on intelligence sharing is very deep. And on the SIGINT side, the United States produces the majority of SIGINT production, but the other 4 members of the Five Eyes also produce in areas where the Americans don't collect. Mm-hmm. So there's a mutual dependence there, even if it's 80-20 rather than more balanced than that.
I see. Okay, very interesting. Are there questions? Sorry. There's one there and one here. Sorry. And here. Very good. So we have 3. So one here, Agda, and the lady there. I'm sorry, I can hardly see you. So if you don't mind introducing yourself and tell us if the question is directed to anybody.
Hello, my name is Zanda Kalniņa-Lukaševica. I'm a member of the Latvian Parliament. And let me come back to the differences that was pointed out at the beginning of the discussion, that if you look at the media and also at the polls, it's either the EU or the US. But if you look what's happened in the NATO summit, it's actually for the benefit of both the EU and US. So my question is, do you think it's only a difference of perspectives, or actually it's a big strategic challenge for the European Union? Because if the national policies are being built around this either or more governments build their policies on either or, the EU or aligning with the US, so can it actually bring big strategic problems for the EU and by that to our security?
Thank you. We'll collect the 3 questions, so please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvie. Anna Diamantopoulou from the previous commissioner. 2 questions. The first one, let's hope that there will be the increase of 3.5 in all member states, and it will be very effective in 2013. Will it be a national result or a European result? Since we know that there is this segmentation and this overlapping of defense production in all member states. The second question, it is the coalition of willings. Which will be the members of this coalition? John said, and rightly said, that there are 6 members who have the stronger defense powers in the NATO, and one of them is Turkey. So Turkey has not respected European Union and NATO concerning the sanctions for Russia, is a close ally to Iran, has a casus belli for a member state, has occupied members of Cyprus, and now has a very close ally, a legal agreement with Libya. So do you believe that we can overcome this internal problem, and how are we going to do that? Because it is obvious that Turkey is a very important ally in this period. Thank you.
Thank you. Magda? Here, please, in the front. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maida Ruga, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, the US program. I just had a sort of a 2-finger question for Sir Thomas More, and then one question for Tom Bugger that I'll ask also in a closed session tomorrow, but I was curious.
I'm not Sir Thomas More, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
To disappoint you. He died a few hundred years ago. A nasty death.
Well, at least I hope it was a compliment. Probably not. My question for you was just a little bit perhaps more specific on the sort of lack of confidence in the US intelligence reporting that is sort of emerging in the public on President Trump undermining his intelligence agencies on the question first of whether Iran had made a decision to make a nuclear bomb, and then now on the question of whether the uranium stockpiles had indeed been destroyed or not in the attacks. Does that sort of flip-flopping in US in the public domain, if I understand you correctly, not affect the intelligence sharing within FI? Should we feel that, despite the sort of public debate, this is still very strong? And depending on that answer, what would you advise the Europeans, following up to Sylvie's question at the beginning, should they and how develop their own intelligence production capacity? And I guess that's enough. I have another for Tom Bugger, but I'll ask you tomorrow.
Okay. So do you want to start, and then we'll go to the other questions?
Sure. Just starting with that last question. Clearly, President Trump has a conflicted relationship with the intelligence agencies. That doesn't mean that the Five Eyes relationship doesn't operate at high level, at the head of government level. It operates at agency level. That's where the integration is. Now, I don't think the strikes on Iran in the last 2 weeks were because of an imminent move to produce nuclear weapons themselves. They convert their capability into weaponry. The intent of the Iranian program was clear. If you want a civil nuclear power capability, you only need 4% enriched uranium, 4%. Why produce the 60%, and why bury it so 80, 100 meters underground in order to protect it? The direction, why indulge in a widespread weaponization program? This wasn't a preemptive strike by the Israelis and the Americans because there was an imminent move to weaponry. It was a preventive strike to prevent the Iranians going down the road which they've been going down for the last 20 years or so. I think, I don't often commend what President Trump does, but I think the decision to get involved early and to tell the Israelis, right after we take out these nuclear facilities, you will stop trying to collapse the Iranian regime, because that way lies chaos. And I think that was a sensible balance which the Israelis seem to have absorbed and accepted for now. It doesn't have an impact on intelligence. Of course, the statements after the strike were largely political statements, not based on intelligence assessments. And I think the leaked intelligence assessment to the New York Times also was based on a very quick readout, which couldn't have been really evidence-based either. So you take your pick on this. We'll only really know, and the Iranians will only really know in a matter of weeks or months what the outcome of the strikes actually were. So I don't think there's a direct impact there. If I could just, if I've got the microphone, just one quick word on Turkey. I agree Turkey is an absolutely vital partner on European security. An important role on Ukraine. It's a bridge into the Middle East. President Erdogan is not the easiest of partners, to say the least. But I think I was surprised you cited Libya, and the Turks have actually been the one country which has tried to uphold a UN-supported process in Tripoli against the rebels based in Benghazi. Now, we'll see how that all works out. Just because Erdogan, like Trump, has unattractive features to his leadership doesn't mean that all their decisions are unacceptable, or that the need to engage them as a nation isn't as great as it always was.
Okay, quickly, because we have little time. Thomas, you want to answer any of the other
yes,
questions?
maybe on the Latvian question first, because I started my comment by saying, in contrary to the public opinion poll findings presented by Mark, this NATO summit to me was characterized not by an either-or, but actually by a win for both sides, if you will. Now, that is not to say that the opinion poll is in any way wrong. I think it gives us a reflection of how European societies feel about these questions today. And of course that is a problem for the EU. And of course that is a problem for every single government or executive, how to sort of frame, structure, and communicate the relationship with the United States. And that problem is, in my opinion, is only going to grow. It's not going to go away. What I tried to say was the NATO summit was actually also a success because it did not fall into that trap, because it was not limited to this either-or debate. It actually overcame that. Thanks to those who framed it, thanks to those who ran it, thanks to those who choreographed it the way they did. Short summit, short declaration, a very pointed result. But the problem in itself will not go away. That's what we will discuss tomorrow, Maida, in the policy salon, just as a teaser for that. But what is that transatlantic relationship with a US government that is partly pushy in a conventional sense, but also partly revolutionary, directly intervening into European domestic politics in our countries? There's no easy answer to that, but so that is a problem. Maybe one other point on because I think this format question will continue to be a part of our conversations all along. And John has named sort of 3+3 countries as a suggestion of those who bring something to the table. From a decade of discussions and reflections on the eternal question of German leadership in Europe, I have this there is a legitimacy end of the spectrum and an efficiency end of the spectrum. If the EU 27 is at the legitimacy end of the spectrum. But if you want something efficient, and we all feel that we're in an existential situation as Europe, you need something more efficient. It needs to be smaller. But the more efficient you want to be, the further you get away from the legitimacy end of the spectrum. So there is no good solution to that. And my suggestion is not to try to define any format. I don't believe in the foreign policy directorate that is somehow written into the treaties. It will never happen. It cannot happen. It will not be acceptable. And yet there will be countries who bring something to the table who will band together. And there will be countries within the EU, and I'm sure there will be countries outside of the EU. Britain, to me, is the most obvious one, because I would put Ukraine and Turkey in a different category still, but they're both important in their own right. So, but this is how I see it. It's more something fluid, something situational, something that where we oscillate. It's not something that we should try to define as an ideal solution, because it doesn't exist.
And can I just say, I didn't mean to propose a new format. I was just identifying that there are important military powers inside the EU and important ones outside the EU. Coalition of the willing, the focus is on the last word, the willing.
Absolutely,
and Luxembourg can be willing. And,
Yes.
so it's those who want to be part of it, but they won't be exclusively within one particular framework.
Very good. Clément, you wanted to add something?
No, just briefly on the either-or debate. The paradox is that in practice, I think if you would ask President Trump, President Macron, Chancellor Merz, Prime Minister Tusk, and a lot of others in Europe, if they agree so that European countries should increase their spending targets or defense spending, everyone would say yes now. This is quite new, but everyone will say yes now. And the Americans are fine with that, they are asking that. Where there will be a difference, and probably a lot of nuances between European countries, is where we put the money. From an American perspective, it means buying more American equipment. From a French perspective, and probably for a few others at least, it would mean reduce our dependency to American equipment. And this is a big difference. Not about doing more or spending more in Europe on defense. This is consensus now. We have to do it, but the concept or the principle, I think, is an agreement on both sides of the Atlantic. Just on the member states versus EU levels, I think there are three elements in one word on which the EU can bring something: money, industrial cooperation, and governance. Because the EU is sometimes complex, sometimes boring about processes and so on, but having a process, like peer pressure, like peer reviews, this is all a bit boring and administrative. But I think it would help keeping the momentum, because it would put pressure every year on all member states to follow on the targets, on the defense spending. And with this, we know how to do it at the EU level. So we should use also for governance EU format.
Okay, last quick word, Camille.
No, in literally 30 seconds. One on the either or. The good news is that the to-do list is the same. Whether we wouldn't want to be US allies in good standing and have a good relationship with the Americans, or whether we need to act on our own, 90% of the to-do list overlaps. So that is something that we have to keep on our mind, because essentially, from a strictly military perspective, what we have to do is roughly the same, and then there will be more focus on specific capabilities if it is indeed to plan without the Americans. Second, on national results, whether European versus European results, I wanted to stress the issue of governance. I think I very much welcome the new role that the Commission is establishing for itself, but it really needs to organize a governance that I believe it should be dedicated to defense, that is slightly different from the traditional toolbox. This is not necessarily easy to get Brussels to operate under those terms, but it is something that needs to happen. And finally, on this notion of coalition of the willing and how do we deal with different countries, I wanted to flag the EU-UK Security Pact as a sort of interesting milestone, in the sense that it shows that the EU can work and reach out, including on those security and defense conversations, to third parties in a sort of mutually beneficial framework. We, with Jana and Niku, we recommended that something along the same lines should be worked on for Ukraine. It's going to be very different, possibly, the content, but that is definitely something that we should be working on. And why not on Turkey, if both sides can work on that type of arrangements?
Very good. Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry for those who had questions, but we can discuss still during breaks. And thank you very much to our panelists, and leave you in the safe hands of my great friend Luca.
Thanks a lot for an excellent panel, and nice shoes, Sylvie.